which just lists the details of the webinar series. All right, at this point, we're ready to go, and at this point you should definitely see the full screen with the intro slide for the webinar series. Welcome to the first of 4 webinars which we're hosting as part of Charles Sturt University short course series. This webinar series is about building apps for the Windows Phone 8 platform. My name's Nick Roundoff. I run a company called Built to Roam, and I guess I'm privileged enough to be the first of, well, hopefully be many webinar presentations by Charles Sturt Uni. To kick off the short course series, we are focusing on the recently announced Windows Phone 8 platform. And over the course of the next 4 webinars, you should get an overview of building applications for this platform. A lot of the knowledge that you might have had from previous platforms will carry forward. So if you've worked with Windows Phone, Phone 7, or you've already made a start on working with Windows 8, then a lot of this will be familiar. Hopefully over the course of at least today's webinar, you'll get an idea, a full flavour of what's possible with the Windows 8 platform, or the Windows Phone 8 platform, and I guess where you can go for more information. This session is recorded, so we will get the recording up shortly after the webinar. There will be additional discussion forums on the Moodle site that you should have access to following this presentation. There'll also be some labs that are posted for you to complete during the week. The expectation is that you will try and get those done so that you are just building up that familiarity with the Windows Phone 8 platform during the course of these webinars. There is an exam that will follow this week after. It's an open book exam, primarily multi-choice. So that's really just a matter of you just making sure that you've got a good understanding of what we've covered in the courseware. So without any further ado, we're going to jump in. And one of the things you'll notice on this initial slide is the use of the live tiles on the right-hand side. And I guess one of the things we wanted to carry forward is this flavor of the live apps or the live tiles. It is one of the distinguishing features of Windows Phone. And one of the things that's really nice about the Windows Phone 8 platform is we've gone from having one square tile, or one size of tile, to having 3 that an application can develop for. And we'll touch on those on the course of today as well. Through today's webinar, we're going to cover a series of things. We're going to look at the overall app platform for Windows 8. We'll look at the different types of development models you can use to build against it. We'll also do a comparison between where Windows Phone 8 sits and where Big Windows sits, so Windows 8 or Windows RT. We'll look at the application models, so whether you're building native code or managed code or a bit of both. And then we'll go through, I guess, what are the tools available for building for Windows 8, and we'll look at some of the compatibility things that you should be aware of in terms of building for both Windows Phone 7, but also discuss how you can build code that potentially is compatible with Windows 8 as well. One of the really exciting things about Windows Phone 8 is the new hardware that's coming to market. Okay, most of you might have seen some of the announcements around Nokia, HTC, and Samsung about their devices. So the Nokias have got 2 devices, the 920 and the 820. HTC's got the 8X and the 8S, both coming to market, and the Samsung device is looking awesome as well. They are different form factors in the sense that they're different physical size, and the OEMs have tried to differentiate themselves through a number of things in terms of the lens on the camera, the overall craftsmanship of the device, the size, the weight, those types of things. Underneath it all, there is the core Windows 8 experience, and this is highlighted here again in that use of the live tiles. So we'll keep coming back to this as a big theme, and it's a theme that maintains across both Windows Phone and the big Windows on the desktop. A number of other improvements in the Windows Phone 8 platform. We've now got support for multi-core chipset. a new graphics processor, increased RAM size, and a number of different screen resolutions that we can build for, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about what this means as a development platform. We've got the ability for the devices to support removable storage, and the storage that's available on the device is also encryptable as well. Lastly, we've also got the support within the platform for NFC, and what you'll see is that the top-end devices coming to market supporting NFC, which open up a range of different possibilities in terms of how we build apps and how we build apps to take advantage of NFC as it rolls out into enterprises, and more companies start to use NFC for payment, for exchange of data, those types of scenarios. As you're probably aware, that the shift from Windows Phone 7 to Windows Phone 8 is a very big change from the ground up. We've moved away from the original kernel across onto a shared core with Windows 8. So what used to be Windows CE has now been replaced by a common Windows core that is split across both Windows 8 and Windows Phone 8. Okay, and I guess this can leave a little bit of a misconception that the app development model for both Windows and Windows 8 Phone 8 is going to be the same. Okay, and whilst there are some similarities between the two, there are still some distinct differences. Okay, what the shared core does mean is that things like the device drivers, the underlying kernel, the graphics adapters, those types of things are the same across the two platforms, which means that the OEMs can iterate the hardware more frequently. At the device level, at the native code level, we can get a lot of reuse that we would otherwise not see. In the managed space, whilst a lot of the concepts are the same, so we're using XAML, we're using C#, those types of things, the reality is that we can't just take code from one platform and directly use it on another. It's not the ability to pick up an executable and just rerun it across the two. There are some differences at the moment that mean that we might need to do a little bit of work. And actually, if you look at it from just a usability and design perspective, you probably wouldn't want to pick up an application that's designed for big Windows and actually run it just on a Windows Phone 8 device. You'd probably want to change the way that it's structured. I mean, just one of the fundamental differences between the two is that Windows 8 is predominantly a landscape view, although it does support portrait, whereas Windows Phone 8 is predominantly portrait, and of course it does support landscape. So just from that perspective, you're going to restructure how your apps look and how they behave. The APIs across the Windows Phone 8 device, we do have a range of different models that you can use to build for it, and those are starting from managed through to managed plus native through to pure native code development. And this is again one of the big changes that happened between Phone 7, where the development was all managed code, through to what we have in Windows Phone 8, where a lot of those existing native code libraries that other platforms might have can now be ported across to Windows Phone 8, which again means that we've got many more opportunities for developers to take existing code bases and repurpose them, or for fresh ideas to be done in a cross-platform way using native code. Okay. There's also an opportunity for game developers to take those existing libraries as well and bring those across to Windows Phone 8. In the past, we had support for XNA, and as what we'll see over time is that we can still build XNA-based applications targeting the Windows Phone 7.1 runtime, and those will continue to run on the Windows Phone 8 devices. There is currently no strategy for building a game in XNA targeting the Windows Phone 8 SDK itself. Okay. So as we can see here with the building blocks, there is a number of different mechanisms or different models that we can use to build our application, depending on which components we want to make use of, whether it's native or managed or a bit of both. And these are actually all supported with the templates that come with Visual Studio. So you can go in, and when you go to create a new application, you can tell what type of application you want to look at building. When we look at the APIs that are available for Windows Phone, one of the challenges presented with the shift across to a common core with Windows 8 is, what do we do with all the existing applications? So what you'll see with Windows Phone 8 is there's a high level of compatibility back with Windows Phone 7.2 5.1. And this would be expected. So, developers that have invested the last 2-3 years of their skills in terms of building for Windows Phone, those skills will directly come forward to Windows Phone 8. In addition to that, there's a number of new classes that are available with Windows Phone 8. For example, support for the wallet, so you can actually surface your application and any membership information or payment information via the shared wallet across the device. There's new tasks such as the Share Media task and the Maps task. There's access to external storage and VoIP and a whole range of other APIs that have been surfaced through the managed interfaces. If we look at the cross-section between the full Windows API, so WinRT, where there's about 11,000 members, and we look at the subset which has been made available to Windows Phone, we get approximately just short of 3,000 members have been ported across. And then there's a whole bunch of additional APIs that are available to not just the managed world, but also to native code. So these new APIs are actually implemented in C++ and then projected into both C#/VB and into the native world in C++. Currently, there is no support for the HTML5 JavaScript projection that's currently available for Windows 8 developers, which means that you can't build a dedicated, component application using those technologies. There are some workarounds similar to the model used by something like PhoneGap, where you essentially have a native or a managed wrapper for your application, and then you can host a web browser control to actually render the HTML and JavaScript. Clearly, there's some phone-specific additions to the Windows Phone runtime, so things like support for VoIP and for accessing the lock screen and those types of things. Those types of tasks that are clearly developers will want to make access to, or have access to, from both the managed and the native world. So when it comes down to choosing APIs, there's a range of new APIs that are exposed. One of the challenges set by the shared core is, of course, we want to make use of a number of the existing Windows APIs and bring those across. So now what you'll find is that there are a number of ways to do certain tasks. So for example, file I/O, you can use the legacy isolated storage APIs, or you can flip across to the new Windows Phone runtime APIs, which are all Windows.storage namespace. Okay, now one of the interesting things there is if you look at the legacy APIs, they're predominantly synchronous APIs. So for example, reading and writing from a file is a synchronous operations where you use the isolated storage namespace. If you look at Windows.storage and the APIs made available in that namespace, they're predominantly asynchronous. So we have this change in the pattern that developers should be engaging to. And increasingly we're seeing this shift across to this asynchronous programming model. So the use of the async and the await keywords. Now one note to make here is that if you're looking at building for Windows Phone 7 and you want to make use of the async await pattern, you can now do that as part of the Windows Phone 8 SDK. So the new SDK that comes down that plugs into Visual Studio 2012 actually enables both the development of Windows Phone 7 and the Windows Phone 8 development environments. For Windows Phone 7, if you're going to use the new SDK, out of the box you don't get the support for the async await keywords. But if you download there's a NuGet package called Microsoft.bcl.async, and the inclusion of that in your project actually will enable you to start using that asynchronous programming model within your Windows Phone 7 application. So that's just the points in the slide at the bottom there. Basically, if you're looking at targeting both the Windows Phone 7 and Windows Phone 8, then you probably want to stick with the legacy APIs, so that, for example, isolated storage. If you're looking at sharing code between Windows Phone 8 and Windows 8, then you're probably looking at using the Windows Phone runtime API, so for example, Windows.storage. There are also a number of Win32 APIs that are exposed as part of the Windows Phone runtime, and primarily these are for native code developers for doing some of the low-level tasks that they'd want to do within their code. And our managed applications can make use of those by routing it through a native project. However, there should be very few circumstances where this should be required. And actually one of the overheads that you'll see there is that interop layer between the managed and the native world. So unless you're going to move across and actually do a substantial chunk of work in the native code, you need to actually bear in mind that there is that trade-off between the performance gain of writing things in native code versus the trade-off of the bridge between the managed and native world. Okay, so when we look at how Visual Studio operates, we've got a number of different application models that we can choose to build. The obvious one for most of us will be this an application written in managed code using XAML as the mechanism that we use for doing the layout on the page. So in this case, as the diagram it illustrates, we've got managed APIs for coding against and both the .NET APIs and the Windows Phone runtimes. Okay. If you look on the right-hand side, we'll see that there's the new project dialog from Visual Studio, and you can see there's a number of different options in terms of just the purely managed application. So we've got a Windows Phone app, which is our very base level application. There's really no template there other than a basic page. We've got a data-bound option, we've got a class library, we've got panorama apps, and we've got pivot apps. So some demonstrating app templates that we can use to base our project on. I would encourage you, if you haven't already worked with Windows Phone, and even if you're new, if you've been doing some work with Windows Phone and yet you're not familiar with the Windows Phone 8 SDK, it's worth taking a look at each of those samples and look at how they've been put together, just so you get a flavor of how other people can actually write their code and how to make use of things like the panorama control and the pivot control. All right, so let's actually flip across, and I'll actually start up a very basic application. So we've got here Visual Studio, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to go File, New Project, and we'll see here the new project dialog we just saw in the slides. And we're actually just going to start off with a very basic application, but we are going to select the Panorama app. Okay, and you can see over there on the right-hand side that it's given us a preview of what this application might look like. I'm going to click OK to accept that, and it gives us the ability to choose between a Phone 7.1 and an 8.0 application. As I mentioned before, you can deploy a Windows Phone 7.1 application from Visual Studio. And this might be important at the moment, particularly when the majority of devices that are in market are actually running Windows Phone 7.1. Okay. As we move forward, and the expectation would be that the market will change over time, you might decide that you only want to build for Windows Phone 8. Okay. When you go to submit your app to Marketplace, you should be aware that if you submit initially your application as a Windows Phone 8 application, you won't be able to backfill at the moment with a Windows Phone 7.1 version of the application. So the guidance there is if you're considering supporting both platforms, that you start with the 7.1 application and then provide an upgrade path for those people with a Windows Phone 8 device. In this case, we'll actually start with a Windows Phone 8 application, and I'll just make a couple of notes about the changes that have happened in the project structure. Okay, so we can see here some templated XAML. Okay, and if we look over the right-hand side here in my Solution Explorer, you'll notice that it's already filled it out with a number of different things. If you're used to working with the Windows Phone SDK, you'll notice that there's a couple of things that are missing out of here. Okay, one of which is the splash screen. Okay. Previously, the template within Visual Studio actually included an image called splash screen image.jpg, and this was the splash screen that would appear during your application startup as a placeholder for while your application is priming. It's been removed for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that we saw a number of applications actually being published to the Marketplace with that default splash screen in there. It was a pretty ugly splash screen with a little cursor, wait timer thing in the middle. The guidance is that you should really replace this with your own style splash screen that promotes your brand. The other thought was that with the improvements that we're seeing in terms of the performance of the application and the load time on the device, ideally you should get your application to a point where you should no longer need that splash screen. Now, of course, if you do need the splash screen, or you do feel that you want to have your bit of flash of promotion at the beginning of your application, by all means you could put that image back in there. It's still called the same thing, splash screen image.jpg, and of course your splash screen will show. Okay. The other thing you'll notice is that all of our the other images, so the application icon and the default tile, which used to be called background image, oh, sorry, just background.png, have now moved. Okay, these have actually been placed under an assets folder. So this is our application icon, and our default tile is actually moved. And now, because we've got a number of different tiles that our application can support, or different styles of tile that our application can support, you'll notice that there's a number of different templates that have been included here. Okay. We'll actually go ahead and actually run this. And here we have our new emulator. Okay. And you'll see that it actually looks very similar to the emulators that shipped with the previous SDK. Again, the interaction model with the emulator is very similar, so I can drag with the mouse. If you've got a touchscreen, it's also enabled to work with that. We've still got an additional set of tools with a couple of additions, primarily this network tab, and I'll come back to why this is significant in a little bit, but primarily this was added to ensure that you could diagnose any networking or connectivity issues that you had with the emulator. Okay. The other thing I want to do is actually switch over to the companion design tool that's available for Windows Phone applications. So we're actually going to right-click on our application in Solution Explorer and select the Open in Blend option. Okay. Now bear in mind, these tools are all free with the SDK download for Windows Phone development. So opening this in Blend, again, we've got this designer-based experience, so we can actually see what our application looks like at design time. And Blend is different from Visual Studio in that it's really designed and optimized for doing design work. So everything from support for design data, so you can see that over on the right-hand side, you can actually see that we've got some design time data that's actually, you can see the yellow border, it means that it's actually data bound to what's being displayed on the current screen. Okay, we can go ahead and modify those, add things, remove things, and actually those can be reflected on the design surface. Yeah. Let's just actually flip back to our slides now. We'll continue the presentation. Another option we have for building our Windows Phone application is actually to build with XNA. Now, I did make the point that this is actually using the APIs that were available to Windows Phone 7.1. In fact, these are built against the old APIs and are not built against the new set of APIs available Windows Phone 8. Okay. These are in Visual Studio. These are exactly the same templates you would have got back in Visual Studio 2010, and it's really targeting the old set of assemblies. Okay. The new model for building out games for Windows Phone 8 is to actually use native code and a combination of either Direct3D or DirectX for actually building out the UI for your games or applications. Okay, this is primarily to support games that have come from other platforms or use native engines as part of the applications. Okay. One of the nice things that we do have is the ability to build a combined application that combines Direct3D and XAML. One of the challenges presented by some of particularly the gaming engines, and we saw this back with XNA, is that the ability to link XNA and XAML within the same application means that we can rapidly build out our game in, well, what was XNA, but now we're building with Direct3D. But for things like menus and other things like that, it was much easier and quicker to build those in XAML. And so we can do a lot of the heavy lifting with XAML and then incorporate some native graphics with the 3D capabilities. Okay, so we can actually build combined applications that make use of both technologies within the same application. Okay. The other way is even if we don't have any UI component that we do at a native level, we can still make use of native code libraries from within our managed application. So here, literally illustrating the fact that from our managed application, we can reach down into native code, execute some logic, and then push it back into the managed world. I mentioned before that there is no support for the HTML5/JavaScript projection from the Windows RT runtime. To do that form of HTML5 style application, the way that we could do it within a Windows Phone application is to use the fact that we've got a web browser control, which is based on the same technology that the Internet Explorer browser is based on the device. And so this gives us a really powerful JavaScript processing engine and has support for a number of the HTML5 specs. Okay. But the challenge is that it does present within a web browser control, so it is not a native application, but you can leverage things like the work done by PhoneGap to expose some of the device-based capabilities through into your HTML5-based application. To support this, there is actually a Windows Phone HTML5 app template that's actually available with Visual Studio, and you can use this to get started. Now, I notice there's a number of questions and a couple of hands going up. Let me just check how things are going over here. Okay, so what I'll try and do is, there's a couple of questions in here that I just want to take an opportunity to answer at the moment as we go through. No, there's currently no word around the availability of Windows Phone 7.8, and for those who aren't aware, the 7.8 update is an update that Microsoft are looking at bringing out for existing Windows Phone 7 devices, and as they've indicated, the primary feature that they're going to bring as part of that update is the new live tile structure, so the ability to have the different live tiles sizes. The new network emulation doesn't easily support Fiddler. It is possible to get it to work. We've also used things like Wireshark to do some monitoring over what's actually going on with the emulator. Okay. All right, let me just minimize this back. Okay. So the question is, where do we get started with developing for Windows Phone 8? I've indicated that there's a number of tools that make up the Windows Phone SDK. The question is, where do we get them? All of the tools that you'll need to build for Windows Phone applications are available via the Developer Center, and the URL is big in the middle of the screen. It's dev.windowsphone.com. Formerly, this was called the App Hub and was at create.msdn.com. But as part of the rationalization process around both Windows and Windows Phone, this has been brought back to the Windows Phone Developer Center, so dev.windowsphone.com. The SDKs are completely free, and so as part of that download, you'll get Visual Studio, you'll get Expression Blend for building for Windows Phone. Okay, and they come with the emulation technology that you need in order to test your applications. Okay, so there's also a number of other resources available via the Dev Center. So you'll see here that across the top we've got the dashboard. So that's where you go to actually submit your applications for certification. We've got Develop, Community, and Help. And those are all great areas to get more access to information about the APIs, talk to via the forums, and actually raising support tickets in the help area. The support ticket area is actually really important, particularly if you run into difficulties with the submission and the certification process for your application. You can quite easily raise a support ticket, and Microsoft's very, very keen to help resolve any issues you might have. Now, one of the things that we have seen with the Windows Phone SDK is that the minimum bar for your computer specs has actually increased. So it does require Windows 8, and it does require a Windows 8 Pro or higher for the emulation support. Okay, and this is the big one, is that it requires second level address translation, which is often the area where a number of devices fall down. Okay, so the reason why this is required is that the emulation technology in the Windows Phone SDK has actually changed from being the old virtual PC based technology across to using Hyper-V. And so what we'll see now is that when you actually launch your emulator, you're actually launching a virtual machine. And if you go to Hyper-V Manager, you can actually see that the emulator is there listed as one of the virtual machines, and it uses a snapshot for each time you actually run and deploy the emulator. Okay, this actually gives us much better startup and resume time for the emulator once you've launched it for the first time. Okay, there are some tools available from sysinternals, which is owned by Microsoft now, that you can use to actually detect whether your device has got SLAT support. One thing to note though is that these the result data from those tools varies once you've actually installed Hyper-V onto your machine. Okay, so if you actually run this, you actually see when the final record here, which says supports Intel-enabled extended page tables, i.e. SLAT. You should see a star in that row in order to run the Windows Phone 8 emulators. Now, if the SDK installs but you don't have support for the emulators, that's not the end of the world. It does mean that you'll actually have to do your development and testing on a real device. Now, the Windows Phone developer account is actually not required in order to download the SDK and start developing apps. However, you will need a developer account if you want to unlock a phone for development and testing. And if you want to then go forward and submit your app for testing and publication in the Windows Phone Store. Okay. The developer account is available for MCN subscriptions. It's free to students on DreamSpark. Alternatively, there is a $99 charge for individual developers. All of this can be seen at the Developer Center, and clearly that it is localized to your currency. All right, I've talked a little bit about the APIs and how those have changed, but let's talk a little bit more now about the individual features that have been delivered in Windows Phone 8. Okay, and actually this discussion will continue into the next couple of webinars where we actually drill in and actually have a look at more detail of some of these features. Today is really going to give you a high-level view of what these features are and what you should start to think about in terms of building your application. Windows Phone has always been geared around this concept of the live tile and the start screen. In the previous iterations, we've seen that developers can start it off with just being able to have access to the primary tile. So this was the tile that you got when you went to the applications list, tapped and hold, and then you get the option to pin to start. So your tile would appear on the start screen. In the Mango release, which is Windows Phone 7.5, we saw that developers now have the ability to go beyond just that primary tile. We now have the ability to write on the front and the back of tiles, and we also have the ability to generate secondary tiles. Okay, so this means that you can pin different parts of your application to the start screen, and they will link directly into a certain part of the application. I use the Qantas app as an example. If you haven't seen that app, Qantas is obviously an airline, and what you can do is actually list the flights that you've got scheduled within the application. You can select on hold on one of those flights and actually pin those flights to your start screen. This is neat because it means that the Qantas will then update those tiles as you get closer to the flight. So it will tell you to check in, it will tell you to go to the airport, it will tell you to go to the gate, and then once your flight's actually completed, it'll actually remove the live tile. The really nice thing there is if I need more information, I can tap on those tiles and actually go to the relevant part of the application. One of the limitations around those tiles was that we were only limited to a single size, and with two tiles alongside each other, you pretty much got 4 or 5 to a screen. There was only a set number of applications the user could have on a screen at a time. In fact, some of the first-party applications like Calendar actually took up the whole width of the device, okay, because they had this large tile. But it wasn't really the user's choice as to what size tile they allocated to a particular application. With Windows Phone 8, this has changed a little bit. In fact, it's changed quite a lot. Developers now have access to 3 different sizes. So they've got the regular size or the squared size tile. They've got a small tile, which is a quarter of the size, and then they've got a large tile, which is effectively double the size or the full width of the device. Okay. Now when you see a Windows Phone 8 device, every user will have their start screen configured differently with the different apps all configured with different size tiles, okay? And it really adds that personal aspect to the Windows Phone device. In addition to the 3 different types, we've actually got 3 different templates to go with it. So we've got the flip tile, which basically is what we've had in Mango, which is basically the ability to write content on the front and the back of the tile. We've got iconic tiles, okay, so in the middle here we've got what we refer to as like the iconic tiles. One of the drawbacks of the previous form of the tiles is the count or the number of updates or changes. So in the top row here, you'll see that there's a 10 in the black ring. It was really quite ugly, and most developers steered away from it because it conflicted with their brand. It wasn't even consistent with the native or the built-in experience apps. So what developers asked for was a mechanism where they could make their application look similar to the built-in ones. And so the Iconic template really aims to deliver on that. You provide it with a logo, in this case in a white, and the rest of the tile is basically is painted in the accent color, the same way as your built-in applications would. Where there is a count or a number of updates, that'll appear in alongside the icon in the same way as it would for the built-in applications. The last template is actually a cycle, okay, and here you get to actually allocate up to 9 images for the tile to iterate through. Okay, so this is like an extended form of the flip tile, where the tiles will actually flip or cycle through these 9 images. Okay, so these are really good for applications that have got a large number of images that they might want to display to the user. We've also got the ability to extend out the lock screen capabilities of the device. In the past, this was really a reserved area dedicated to where the user could really only set an image, and then certain first-party applications were able to surface information on the screen. Okay, we saw that there's a notification area, and then underneath that there's an icon and a count area for a number of select applications. With Windows Phone 8, your application can register as a lock screen provider. Now it's up to the user to select which application is the lock screen provider. Your application could detect whether it is the current lock screen provider and actually prompt the user to actually select the current application as the lock screen provider. You can also, your application can be one of the 5 apps to show the quick status, so the little icon and the count on the front screen, giving the user control as to really what appears on that lock screen. There's a number of other new launches that are available. So these, for those not familiar with the Windows Phone jargon, we've got this concept of launches and choosers. Launches are really where we want to go and start off some of the first or the built-in experiences from our application. So for example, you might launch the web browser control, or you might launch a phone call. And then we had choosers, which are really about selecting pieces of content from other applications on the device. So for example, you might select a contact number, or take a picture with a camera, for example. Those are chooser because they return data back to the application. So now we've got a series of new launches, and again, their primary function are to invoke parts of the phone's built-in capabilities. So for example, we now have the ability to share an appointment. We've got the ability to share media as one of the social tasks. We've got a series of new map-based tasks, and these are primarily to support the move towards the support for Nokia-based maps across the device as a platform. Just talking about the maps, we do have a brand new set of maps, courtesy of the relationship with Nokia. So you can continue to use the Bing Maps control from Windows Phone SDK 7.1 SDK. But this has been essentially deprecated in favor of using the new maps supplied by Nokia. And this includes a number of new features such as vector-based rendering, different light and dark modes. One of the great examples here is where if you're driving using, say for example, the Nokia Drive application, it'll actually flip between these color modes if you go into a tunnel. It's actually really clever the way it does that. And there's the ability to display landmark and pedestrian features within those applications. And a lot of those features are available within the maps control that you can use within your application. We've also got the ability to do location tracking. This was something that you could do within your application so long as your application was in the foreground. As soon as your application went into the background, the ability to track location in the previous version of Windows Phone was not possible. The one exception to that was that you could assign your application to run underneath the lock screen, in which case the lock screen could come down or the device could power down and your application could continue to track because it was essentially still running as the foreground application. With Windows Phone 8, we've actually got the ability for our applications to run continuously in the background and track the location over time, And this is again showcased by applications such as Nokia Drive, where it basically gives you voice direction even though the application has actually gone into the background. Speech is another important thing added to the whole Windows Phone 8 platform. In the past, it was very limited what you could do with Windows Phone 7, so you could use it for basic launching or just sending and receiving SMSs via voice and the audio features of the phone. Now we have, for your applications, we have a much more sophisticated voice platform that we can use for voice commands and actually use for speech recognition and text-to-speech as part of our applications. And this is fully supported across a number of different languages as supported by the phone. The wallet is a significant feature added to the phone platform. And this is essentially an aggregation points for various debit and credit cards. But we can also surface here any sort of loyalty or membership scheme. So it might be your fitness club or it might be your coffee card. It can also surface up a number of things like deals. So, for example, you might have deals of the day appearing within this wallet concept. And lastly, it also supports this concept of NFC tap to pay. So we'll see a number of those scenarios coming forward. In the past, there's been a number of controls that have been made available as part of both the SDK and the Silverlight Toolkit. Which was available by Codeflex. The toolkit now rebranded as just the Windows Phone Toolkit. Is still available via NuGet, but a number of the controls that were part of that toolkit are now featured as part of the SDK. So for the long list selector is one of these, and this essentially, as you can see in the illustrations here, it gives you this sort of jump list style, where you basically have a list of items in there, and they may be grouped somehow. So, for example, in the buddies list, we can see that they're grouped by the alphabetical letter. If I tap on one of those, I get this list of the alphabet showing me which items or which letters have data beside them. I can click on, so for example, R, and go straight to the R's in the list. Okay. The interesting thing to note about the long list selector is because it's been made as part of the SDK, a lot of work has gone into making sure that this control really performs quite well. And actually the guidance going forward is that this control should be used regardless of whether you just want a flat list or you want this sort of group list. So where you would have formerly used the list box, you should now be considering using the long list selector, okay, to take advantage of both the current performance benefits and the direction that the whole SDK is going in terms of future support. The pivot and the panorama controls are now based in ROM. And the web browser control is, of course, based on IE10. All of these are just to try and deliver more high-performant applications for third-party developers. I mentioned earlier that one of the big improvements that we've got is the changes in the hardware, and this is really signified by the fact that we now have 3 screen resolutions that we can support. Okay. What we're likely to see is that the higher-end devices will, of course, come out featuring the higher resolution devices, or the high-resolution option, so the 720p and the WXGA with 1280 by 768 and 1280 by 720, respectively. And then we've still got the low spec option, so we've still got the 480 by 800 wide BGA. And what's interesting here is that between the wide BGA and the wide XGA, this is a direct scale up because they're both 15 by 9 aspect ratios. So actually what you see when you're actually developing for these is that you don't target for the different platforms in terms of your layout. What you do is you're still building your applications as if they were running on a 480 by 800 device, and this will naturally scale up to the wide XGA form factor. The 720p is slightly different because actually this is a 16 by 9 ratio. What you'll see is, again, when you're building applications, you'll be targeting 480 by, I think it's 853 when you do the calculation in terms of height. So again, same width, just a slightly different height that you've got to account for just because of the different aspect ratio there. In most cases, this won't affect most people. Most applications, as they get built, will allow for a variable height, but you do need to be a little bit careful if you actually fix coding things to a specific height. Okay. In addition, we've got some new features around the camera and the ability to take photos. We've got the ability to build lens-style applications. We've got some additional methods to actually get previews and thumbnail images. We've got some additional areas where we can expose the extensibility features of the Photos Hub, including the ability to actually, there's a new background API for uploading photos to various social networks. Lastly, they've also extended out again the capabilities around the ability to control the camera. So, for example, setting the focal length and the exposure and various things like that in terms of getting a better picture for within your application. In the media space, with the media library class, that's been extended to allow us to, as third-party developers, to actually save songs back into the music library. Okay, so by downloading or media within your application and saving them back to the media library, all of a sudden those media then become available to the entire music and video hub and other applications on the platform. As I mentioned before, there's a couple of additional methods around pictures. So for example, there's a method for getting a thumbnail and actually getting a preview image for a particular image. There's also some additional arguments that are available for the background audio player and some improvements around that background audio task. Okay. As most people are aware, Microsoft is starting to invest quite heavily in Skype, which is an acquisition they made a while ago. We're seeing that there's now a beta version or a preview version of Skype available for Windows Phone 8, as there is available for Windows 8 on the desktop. The nice thing about the Windows Phone 8 implementation is, versus the implementation we saw for Windows Phone 7 is the integration to the core platform makes it feel and look as if it's a built-in call experience. So in the same way as when you receive a call via the normal mobile carrier, it appears in the middle of the screen and says, you know, person XYZ is calling. The same will apply when you get a Skype call. Skype doesn't need to be the foreground app. It needs to be run once to basically sign in, but then it's basically running in the background continuously. Now, continuously might be a bad choice of words because it doesn't actually sit there and run cycles. Actually, what happens is when you receive a Skype call, there's a notification that comes in which basically launches Skype, or it triggers off Skype to actually come back into the foreground and run. So it means that you can receive the call, Skype launches, and then you can do both a voice and or video call. Now, the APIs that are actually available, that have been made available for Skype to do that, are actually available to all developers. So if you have a particular VoIP system that you use or work with, you can actually take advantage of those APIs, including the push notification, to effectively launch your VoIP client and bring it into the foreground. So you can see here that the built-in experience looks as if an incoming phone call, with the exception that the Skype icon is in the top left-hand corner. As we answer the call, Skype comes into the foreground. You can actually see the call in progress. And actually, if you move away from the call while it's in progress, you get the same call running interface as you would for an existing call. So it appears across the top, and you can actually bring that back into the foreground when you've completed doing whatever task you're doing. We've also got support or extended support for Bluetooth and this new support for NFC. In the past, Bluetooth was really just support for pairing devices such as headphones with the device. Now we actually have the ability for developers to interact with those Bluetooth devices. So we can either use the APIs to do app to device, so in terms of integrating, in terms of socket connection to a paired device, or we can actually use the Bluetooth API to do app-to-app communication via Bluetooth, okay, across two different devices. The NFC or proximity APIs, one of the fundamental uses there is actually to establish that app-to-app communication across Bluetooth or across Wi-Fi. Just a note here is that Wi-Fi Direct actually can't be used on Windows Phone 8, but it is available obviously for Windows 8 applications. We can still use infrastructure Wi-Fi and Bluetooth for those app-to-app communication. In addition, we can also use NFC or proximity just for sending data between devices or for interaction with other NFC tags. Of course, one of the scenarios that is supported is the ability to do tap and share between Windows Phone 8 devices and Windows 8 devices. And again, you can leverage this within your applications. There are a bunch of other additional networking enhancements that are provided as part of the Windows Phone runtime APIs. So those networking APIs are again compatible with those available for Windows 8. And actually, one of the nice things there is that you can actually set up a socket connection and actually listen for inbound socket connections. So we've also got support across the Windows Phone 8 platform, not necessarily on every single device. I know that, for example, the 920 from Nokia, the Lumia 920, doesn't support a microSD, whereas their 820 device actually does support a microSD. Now, there are some constraints about the use of the microSD card, primarily that the apps can use the storage APIs to read from SD cards. They can't actually use it to write back to the SD card. In order to read stuff from the SD card, the apps do need to register for specific file types. So, for example, if I have a custom type, I can register that my application is designed to read that, and then I can iterate over files on the SD card with those file extensions. The SD card is also useful for storing photos, music, videos, etc., for like the personal files for the users of the device. And lastly, we can actually install apps from the microSD card. This is actually really only relevant to enterprise applications because they will have been signed with an enterprise cert. We can't actually use this for a generic distribution mechanism for our applications. So you can't think of this as a way to bypass the Windows Phone store. Interesting enough, one of the side effects of the need to have close integration between VoIP clients such as Skype or Lync and the device is the need for those clients to be able to have their own contact store. So, for example, when you sign into Skype, it actually pulls down your Skype contacts and add those in as individual contacts into its own custom store. The advantage there is that those contacts then appear in the People Hub, okay? And you can actually link those contacts with your existing contacts that might come from Outlook or from Exchange or Facebook or Twitter. You can actually link those contacts together to provide these single contact cards for your contacts. Okay, and again, this is available not just to Skype or to Lync, it's also available to your application. I mentioned before that we can establish an association between an app and a particular file extension. We can also do this with and register for our application for an interest in a protocol. So, for example, our application can be launched to handle different file types. So it might be an inbound email. The user clicks on the attachment and launches your application. The other option is that we register for a protocol. So in the case of this slide, we're registering for my protocol. This way, when a URL comes in that starts with my protocol, the user clicks on that URL, launches that URI, our application will launch and actually handle those. In both the case of the file association and the protocol, if our application isn't running at that time or isn't installed on the device, the user will actually be taken across to the Windows Phone store and it'll do a search for applications that have registered for those files or protocol extensions. A big feature of the Windows Phone 8 platform for app developers is the support for in-app purchases. And this is kind of threefold. Firstly, we can now build free applications that provide a very baseline experience, giving us a much wider customer base to target initially. And then we can provide additional features to grow from. We can provide an upselling capability within our application. So from that baseline version, we can then encourage users to purchase additional features in the application or goods and services within the application. And lastly, we can use it to customize our application so users can pay for a different experience within our applications. There are essentially two different types of digital assets we can acquire through in-app purchases. They are durables and consumables. The primary difference is that durables are things that we buy once and own forever, whereas a consumable is something that we can purchase over and over and over again. I mentioned before that there's support for enterprise app deployment. This is one of the features that have been asked for time and time again by companies that want to build and deploy their own internal applications. Rather than them having to go through the testing and the certification and then the publishing process, for the store, which is both time-consuming and costly. They can now actually build and internally test it themselves, and through the use of an enterprise certificate that they pay for, they can actually self-sign those and actually deploy that application out to devices within their organization. And this is actually done in a secure way, and it's not designed as a mechanism to bypass the store for your general consumer-facing applications. Deployment process for those enterprise apps is that the company develops or license an application that they want to feature within their staff. They acquire a certificate, actually use that certificate to sign the application. They then deploy that certificate to the devices within their organization, and then they push out the application to those devices. And because those devices actually have the certificate installed on them, they'll actually be able to install and run those applications. Now, the interesting thing there is if those devices are actually managed by an organization, so they're actually subscribed to a mobile device management service, the company can then actually revoke those applications. Alternatively, if Microsoft determines that enterprise certificate has gone rogue and it's being too widely circulated, they may actually elect to revoke that enterprise certificate, in which case all devices running those applications would not be able to run those applications anymore. And that's specific only to those applications that were deployed through that enterprise certificate. One of the examples that we quite often use for those enterprise-based applications is this idea of a company hub. And this is the first kind of application that you typically deploy through an organization. It's basically a placeholder or starting point for employees. So they might have a list of their apps that they might want to use, and these might be apps both internally and from the general marketplace. There might be headlines from both the general news, but also within the organization. There might be information about their profile, alerts that they should be aware from, those types of things. And again, through the use of live tiles, we can actually surface that information throughout the device for employees. Support in Windows Phone for localization and globalization goes beyond what we had in the previous version of the phone platform. We've now got good support throughout the entire set of controls and page lifecycle for different languages and different flow directions, so the ability to do left to right and right to left. And we can do this at a control by control level. For example, there are some things like network share information that should always display it in a certain way. So we can actually mandate that on certain controls. With Windows Phone 8, the extension of the number of devices that we can get out worldwide and the countries that we can target has gone from 29 countries, the original Windows Phone 7, to 63 countries for Mango, so Windows Phone 7.5, through to over 180 countries now supported by Windows Phone 8. When we look at this in the context of other platforms, it completely dwarfs what's available as a target market for both Apple and Android. In terms of developer, we've now got 140 new countries that we can target. So 38 countries up to 180 countries. In terms of language supports, we've gone from 24 languages through to over 50 languages now supported by Windows Phone 8. One of the most significant things about Windows Phone 8 apps is that they now run faster. Okay. In the past, when you downloaded a Windows Phone 7 application to the device, it was actually interpreted the first time you run it, okay, or as you run it. Now, managed applications are actually native compiled, so compiled down to native code in the phone store prior to being deployed down to your application. Okay. Now you can actually test this as part of the tools that come with Visual Studio, so you can actually deploy and run your application as it would be after it's been engined on the emulator or on the device. So you can actually test for those specific conditions if you have a lot of things that are going to be performance dependent. And in actual fact, even if you're deploying within an enterprise where you wouldn't normally be being deployed through the Windows Phone store, you can actually pre-compile the ZAP file prior to shipping it within your organization. In terms of Windows Phone 7 app compatibility, because the Windows Phone 8 runtimes are slightly different to what was available in 7.1, if we just run 7.1 applications out of the box against the Windows Phone 8 runtimes, what we'd see is we'd expect to see that there'd be some sort of abnormalities or quirks that would happen. So what we're actually seeing is that Windows Phone 7 apps actually run in this quirks mode, okay, which basically forces certain behavior to make sure that Windows Phone 7 applications without a recompile will just run as they're expected to. Okay, and Microsoft's done a lot of work to make sure that for the majority of apps that's the case. Windows Phone 8 applications, clearly they just run directly against the Windows Phone 8 runtime. So this means that there is an upgrade path for your Windows Phone 7 applications. It does mean that you can't just run through the upgrade process and assume that your application is going to work. There are certain areas around source code compatibilities and even binary compatibilities where you may expect something to work and it just doesn't, just because some of the operational mechanisms behind Windows Phone 8 has changed slightly. So for example, there's a number of scenarios here that list where Windows Phone 8 differs from the behavior that was available into Windows Phone 7.1. I won't go through each one of these in detail. These slides will be available as part of the recording, so feel free to take the time to actually go through those and look at the details as to where some of these differences lie. We've also got some binary compatibilities, so in terms of differences there. So for example, the background file transfer has now gone from 5 up to 25. That's now available for Windows Phone 8. Okay, so there's a number of different changes like that that have gone on. Okay, just making use of the Windows Phone 8 SDK tools. We've already seen Visual Studio and Expression Blend as the two primary tools, and obviously the emulator as the tool for doing development testing if you don't have access or don't want to use a real device. One tool that you will have been familiar with if you've done work with the previous SDK is Zune. Okay, and this provided the conduit between Visual Studio or Blend out to a real device. For Windows Phone 8 device, this is no longer required, although it is still required if you plan to deploy out to Windows Phone 7 devices. Before you actually make use of a real physical device for developer testing, you actually need to register that device. So there is this Windows Phone developer registration tool you can make use of. You will, of course, need a Windows developer account. So using a Windows Live ID, you'll need to go and sign up for a developer account. A note here that the recommended approach here is that you do not use a personal Windows Live ID or a personal Microsoft account for this purpose. You should be thinking that this account is going to be permanently tied to that developer account. And as such, particularly for a company, it's recommended that you actually establish a completely separate Microsoft account that's used for the developer registration and developer program. Okay. With that account, and once your account's been verified, you can then use that account to unlock a set number of devices as part of this registration process. Now, once you've actually registered a device, you can then actually deploy to it the same way as you would deploy to the emulator. Within Visual Studio, there's a drop-down at the top that basically allows you to select between the device and one of the 4 different emulators, or 4 different Windows Phone emulators. In actual fact, if you're building for Windows Phone, targeting Windows Phone 7, you'll actually see that there are 6 emulators in there, okay? Because there's the 4 Windows Phone 8 emulators, and then there are the 2 legacy Windows Phone 7 emulators that you can target as well. Just be aware that when you do deploy an application to the phone for developer testing, it does stay on the device. Each time you actually deploy and run the application from Visual Studio, it'll actually overwrite the necessary files. If you actually want to forcibly uninstall and reinstall, you can actually if you do a rebuild within Visual Studio, that will actually clean out, or effectively uninstall the application and reinstall it. Just note that you are limited to actually sideloading or deploying by Visual Studio or the application deployment tool. Just 10 applications on a phone at any one time. So if you get to that threshold, you just simply need to uninstall one of the developer applications you've got and then reinstall the next application. Okay, this only applies to developer applications, so applications that you've sideloaded or installed through Visual Studio or the app deployment tool to those devices. It doesn't apply to applications downloaded through the store or applications provisioned through the enterprise. Okay. Now, we didn't actually see it when I ran up the example application, but Visual Studio provides an exceptional debugging experience and the ability to actually step through and debug your code as you write it. Okay, so you can set breakpoints, you can do step-by-step debugging, you can actually modify and view the contents of variables, and even nested variables and in-depth class structures you can actually interrogate with the development tools. As I mentioned, you can actually deploy and test your application as an optimized native image. Essentially, this is running that process of actually generating the native code, and you can do this by pressing Control F5 or using the performance analysis tool, which is Alt F1. Okay. And the primary purpose here is because you're not stepping through the code in terms of the debugger. You're actually just looking for to test the performance and the responsiveness of your application. I mentioned before that the phone emulator is based on a different technology. It's now based on the Hyper-V virtual machine. And it does feature very similarly to a real phone. In fact, nearly all of the built-in applications are there. You can actually add accounts, remove accounts, even sign up to join a company, all through the emulator. It's not as crippled as it was in the previous versions, where we were limited to just Internet Explorer and third-party applications. In addition, there is also a simulation dashboard that's available within Visual Studio, and you can use this to simulate things that are slightly harder in the emulator. For example, the lock and the unlock of the phone, and the quality and performance of the network connection to the emulator. So you can actually use the simulation dashboard that's available via the Tools menu to actually to test those things. Just a note on the emulator performance, because it is tied to the performance of your host machine. Obviously, the quicker the host machine, the quicker the emulator is going to be. So don't use that as a true evaluation of how your program is going to perform on a real device. There is nothing that substitutes full testing on an end device. Okay. And increasingly, as we're seeing a number of different devices, different screen sizes coming to the market, it is recommended that you do test on a number of, ideally a couple of different devices with different form factors. As I mentioned, deploying to the emulator is simply a matter of selecting a different drop-down in the drop-down, the target device. In the interface, again, it's mouse-based control. You'll notice that when you do select into a text box, the virtual keyboard comes up. This can actually be dismissed by toggling the page up, page down key. It does vary on some keyboards where it might be the pause or the break button, but you can actually dismiss that virtual keyboard and actually use the keyboard on your device. You can also toggle the orientation of the emulator. You'll see on the right-hand side there's this little context bar that comes up, and one of the options there is the ability to toggle or rotate the device left or right, and allows you to test how your application is going to behave in both portrait, which would be the default orientation for most applications, and in landscape. You can also simulate taking an image with the camera. When you do run up the camera within your application or within the core experience, you will actually see this simulated experience. It doesn't leverage the web camera on your host machine. It just has this block that rotates around the screen, allowing you to take different camera shots and just test the behavior of your application as such. You'll also see that on the bottom of this little toolbar there's this chevrons, which opens out and opens up this additional tools pane. And there's a number of different things there that show how we can simulate location, how we can do simulate the accelerometer, so the different orientations of the device. We can also take a screenshot with the additional tools to save what our application is going to look like. And this is particularly important when we go to submit our application to Marketplace or to the store, where we'll actually need to submit screenshots along with our application. All right, so I'll just show you quickly what that looks like. So from here, we actually saw this additional tool windows earlier. If we flick to the location, we can actually see that we've actually got here a big map that we can actually scroll around. And actually, as we change that so we can zoom out, we can actually place push pins on there. And then actually we can actually tell it to play and actually cycle through those push pins. So for example, and that would simulate the location information back into the device as if we were actually roaming with the device. I mentioned before that there's this simulation panel. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and essentially by toggling this radio button, we can actually go between the lock screen being locked or unlocked. So that will actually trigger the lock screen to come up and down. We can actually also use, there's an option there to trigger a reminder. One of the events that can be raised within our application is when the frame or the host pane is actually obscured. Okay, and triggering a reminder will actually trigger that event. And then when the reminder is dismissed, that event is raised again to actually indicate to our application that we can resume functionality. Okay, that's probably more relevant to a game where you've actually got a lot of interactive behavior going on and you actually need to pause things when the screen's partially or fully obscured. So the network simulation is quite good as well for working with, particularly with the emulator, where you can actually control both the speed and the signal strength or signal quality to allow you to do testing and make sure that you cater for when the signal drops out or actually doesn't exist at all. Screenshot tool I mentioned before, you can hit the capture button and then save the captured image as out to an image. Now, one thing to note is that when you run the default application from within Visual Studio, you actually see the performance counters across on the right-hand side. If you're taking screenshots to submit to Marketplace, just make sure you actually don't run your application with Visual Studio attached when you take those screenshots. Otherwise, you end up with those counters actually being submitted as part of your screenshots to the store. Now, one of the lovely new things about Windows Phone 8 is that we can capture real screenshots on the device by pressing the power and the Windows button simultaneously. Now, you might think, okay, well, why hasn't this been on the platform before? The reason being is that Microsoft had to put a lot of effort into making sure that in certain areas that it's important to protect the digital rights of a particular asset. So, for example, if you get a digital rights protected email come in, it's actually not possible to take that screenshot of the page. So it's not actually possible to use the screenshot capability that actually circumvents the digital rights protection on a signed email. Okay, so we've actually reached the end of the set of features and the discussion points for today. What I'm going to do is on the next slide, there's a sort of a way to where to go to from here sort of thing. So there is a portal where you can, it's called Moodle, where you'll be given access to, so you can post questions, collaborate with other students, you can find out other material and actually start walking through the labs. The material from today and the labs will be posted in the next 24 hours, after which they'll be available for you to walk through at your own pace. I would encourage you to participate as much as possible in these forums because we'll try and be involved as much as possible to answer any questions that you have. Now, with that in mind, we've actually got 15 minutes left, so I'll flip over to the questions pane and actually we'll try and answer as many of these as we can prior to closing up the meeting. So let me whiz back up and have a quick look. Once we get the 7.8 update, will all the 7.1 users get pushed to 7.8 like they did for 7.1? Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to actually talk about that as we don't know the full details of 7.8 or the availability timeframe for that. Does PhoneGap support Windows Phone 8? The last time I checked, I don't think that they'd made the support for Windows Phone 8 publicly available. I will have to go and check on that. My understanding is because it primarily plugs into the web browser control to facilitate a number of things, there should be no reason why you shouldn't be able to upgrade that level of support through to Windows Phone 8. I do have NFC built into my Ultrabook. How can I emulate it into the Windows 8 emulator so I can test the Windows Phone NFC application? Look, the only way that you'd be able to simulate something similar to that would be to provide essentially a socket level conduit between the two. It's a lot of work just to test NFC. The simple answer is it's easier to test with a real phone. Unfortunately, that is the answer in terms of doing both NFC, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi testing for applications for Windows Phone 8. Okay, I am a VB.NET programmer. Will I be restricted anyway if I want to program in Windows Windows 8 phone. Do I have to learn C#? No, you don't have to. Unfortunately, the courseware for this particular course is predominantly C#. You shouldn't have any difficulties just stepping through the samples and the lab instructions. If you do, feel free to reach out and I can assist with walking you through with both VB and C#. Are you saying we have to install 64-bit version of Windows 8? My understanding of that is a requirement for the SDKs. If you actually try and run the installer, it'll actually tell you whether your device is actually supported or not on the version of Windows you've got installed. The slides will definitely be available for download after this event. Ideally later this evening, but possibly not until tomorrow at this stage. It depends on whether we can make when we can make the labs available. Greg, in answer to your question to do with Hyper-V, my best guidance I can give you there is to try it and see whether it works. If it doesn't and you think that Slack should be supported, I would try and reach out to the phone team directly. Just one thing to note, when you do have Hyper-V installed, the core info will say that your device does not support Slack. That's just one of the quirks of actually installing Hyper-V, or at least my understanding of what goes on with Hyper-V. Does emulator support location sensors, cameras, and other device features, or do developer testing have to have a phone for those? In most cases, you will need to have a device for a lot of those features. I know that there is basic level support for some of the sensors. So, for example, accelerometer, you can use the additional tools for testing that. And the camera, again, very basic support in the emulator. The presentation is currently not up in the Moodle site, but it will do in the next 24 hours. Andrew, in terms of the Bluetooth device using a serial port profile, at this point I'm not sure. I don't know what the device actually supports in terms of the pairing. The MSDN documentation would be the best one to answer that. I know that once a device is paired with Windows Phone, you can open a socket connection. Hopefully that'll answer your question there. If not, then just reach out to me. I can follow up on that one. Is there Phone 7.1 to Phone 8 migration assistance supplied by Microsoft? Other than what's actually available in Visual Studio, not really. If you run into specific issues, like there are specific errors that you can't resolve, then ask questions on either the forum. You can do it actually on the forums in Moodle, and I will try and do my best to actually assist you with those. In terms of code reuse between Phone 8 and Windows 8 development, you're not likely to get any support, any reuse for the actual XAML, if you're assuming that you're doing managed level development. But you can get quite a high level of reuse with the C# classes and things like your view models and stuff like that. Simply that's a matter of just sharing the files between those projects. You can also, if you've done work with, there's a concept class library called a portable class library. Those you can get a very high level of reuse between Windows Phone 8 and Windows 8. The one thing to watch there is that there are some limitations. So, for example, the classes around sockets isn't very well supported, and there's a couple of little quirks to getting it all to work nicely. William, for Windows Phone 8 development, you need to use Visual Studio 2012 if you want to target the 8 developer libraries. Alternatively, if you want to build an application that works across both Phone 8 and Phone 7, you can continue to use the Visual 2010 tools. Just bear in mind that you will be using you'll be essentially building a Windows Phone 7.1 application, and it should just run on a Windows Phone 8 device. Okay, James actually is one of the organizers, makes a very good point that when you're entering your email address into learn.itmasters.edu.au, just make sure you enter it in lowercase. That system is case sensitive for both the username and password. So Sam's made asked a question, what's the recommended approach for registering a device for testing? I did say not to use a personal account. The reason being is that personal account will then be perpetually at this point tied to the developer account. So even for an individual developer, if your app becomes suddenly a massive hit and you want to sell it, you'd have to sell your personal account with it. So I would recommend establishing another free Microsoft account that you then tie to that developer account. Now the developer account is obviously a paid-for item, or you get it as part of one of the programs. But the actual Microsoft account you can actually get for free. Christopher, at this point, I don't know the anticipated marketplace size for Windows Phone 8. It will obviously grow over what we currently see for Windows Phone 7. In terms of the actual the number of apps that are currently available in the store, I think we've now exceeded the 120,000 apps in Marketplace. Those apps will continue to work across Windows Phone 8, and that is continuing to grow. Like I know that by the end, I think it's the end of this year, we'll have 46 of the 50 top apps across all smartphones available for Windows Phone. And what we're anticipating seeing is that as more developers build applications to target Windows 8, they'll also consider building those across for Windows Phone 8. And because of the tools and the technologies we've got to work with, we'd expect to see a lot more applications for building for Windows Phone or Windows First. Is there a free VS version? Yes, the tools are absolutely free. It does come with Visual Studio and does come with Expression Blend. There's no disadvantages in terms of support for Windows Phone. It's really when you want to go across and do other styles of development, so legacy desktop style development or web development. Those are, or even integration with things like Team Foundation Server and things like that. They're not currently supported in the Express SKU for Visual Studio. They are a paid-for service as part of the Pro or the Enterprise versions of Visual Studio. Is there any difference in developing for Windows Phone 7.1 in 2010 versus the Visual Studio 2012? If you're just targeting Windows Phone 7.1, no, it's targeting the same set of libraries that as part of that. Unfortunately, Greg, if you have already registered with your personal account, it is too late. My only recommendation would be that when you go to publish your application, you publish to a different account. It may be that you can discuss with Microsoft a possibility of exchanging your account over. I'm not in a position to comment on that, though. Unfortunately, at Igor at this stage, it's not possible to change the account link to the stored account, which is why my guidance is that you don't set it up with your personal account. What's happened to the smaller footprint models for cheaper phones available in Mango? So I'm guessing that you're actually referring to the Tango update. I'm not entirely sure where that update will go after this. Clearly, as you can see from the Windows Phone 8 hardware specifications, we've gone up in terms of specification, not down. The likelihood is that Microsoft will continue to support some element of those developing markets, in which case we may see them look at trying to build another low footprint model in the future. At this point, they've not disclosed anything. Can you run Windows 8 applications in Windows 7? Cornelius, I presume that you're referring to Windows Phone 8 running on Windows Phone 7, in which case the answer is no. If you're going to support both Windows Phone 7 and 8, you need to build against the Windows Phone 7 libraries. Now, there are some features that you can leverage as part of building for Windows Phone 7. So, for example, the live tile support. If you're building a Windows Phone 7 application, you can query and actually make use of the new live tile formats. So, for example, if you detect that your application is running on Windows Phone 8, you can actually have the extended support for the large tiles, small tiles, etc., even though your application is built against the 7 libraries. William, at this point, I'm not in a position to say whether they've got plans of bringing the HTML5 JavaScript style projects to Windows Phone 8. As you can see from what we covered today, there has been a massive churn in terms of the underlying platform for Windows Phone. At this point, I'm not sure of where they're planning on going forward. Yes, my anticipation is that I will try and always factor 10 to 15 minutes at the end of every session for questions like this. So feel free to keep on asking questions, and I'll do my best to continue to answer them. So, and we'll do it as part of the recorded session as well, just so that people who can't attend will actually get the ability to see these in the recording. No, unfortunately. So the question is, can we run a Windows Phone 8 application on Windows 8? As I indicated in the earlier slide, there are some incompatibilities between the two platforms. So as such, we can't just pick up a Windows Phone 8 and actually run it on Windows 8. The best approach is for you to build up two different UIs and link in the same code files to get as much reuse as you can. Yes, definitely going forward, Greg, the sessions will be much more hands-on for future sessions. Today was really about just giving you guys an overview of the changes that have been coming and where we go from there. I'll endeavour to make at least do demos for the features that we talk about in future sessions. So William, in terms of your account for Windows Phone 7, yes, absolutely. It's actually the same account. So the account that you had for Windows Phone 7 will now be an account that you can use for building and submitting Windows Phone 8 accounts. The one point of guidance that I did highlight there is if you're anticipating that you're going to build an application that's going to run across Phone 7 and Phone 8, or that you want to support both, make sure that you deploy a Windows Phone 7 version of your application first, or you submit that to Marketplace first, and then submit the Windows, like if you rebuild it against the Windows Phone 8 SDK, you can then submit that as an update and effectively have two different versions of your application listed as a single application. So depending on whether people have got a Phone 8 or a Phone 7 device, they'll see the different versions in Marketplace. There will be no confusion that somebody will see two versions of the same app. The issue is if you were to go and submit a Windows Phone 8 application initially, you wouldn't be then able to provide a Windows Phone 7 update or version of your application. Matthew, I'm sorry. Let me scan back up. I didn't see your WCF question. Matthew, I might get you to repeat that question. I'm not seeing it in the list. Oh, sorry. Is the much same way of WCF supported for Windows 8 mobile apps? Look, the support for WCF, my understanding is it's very similar to what was there in Windows Phone 7. Vicky, that might actually be me stop talking after I've answered a question. Hopefully the audio will come through in the recording so that you won't miss out on any of that. I apologize if it is cutting out. We'll try and make sure that we sort that out for any of the future sessions. So sorry, Matthew, coming back to your point about WCF, my understanding is that there's not a huge amount of additional features as part of the support for WCF. I think that you do have the ability to do much lower level stuff, so support for raw sockets and things like that. But I don't think that they've provided additional support for some of the additional features that's available in WCF. I think it's still listed as the basic HTTP binding support. William, the danger of having your personal account registered with your Windows Phone 7 account is that if sometime in the future your application becomes wildly successful and you want to sell it to another organization, they would either need to take your application and list it against a different developer account, or they'd have to buy your developer account and your personal account as part of that deal. So my guidance is, just in case you ever want to transfer your app, you should list it using a separate ID. Mohammed, in terms of books for reading, of course, as an author, I would probably promote my own book, but that's probably not the best case in terms of Windows 8 specific stuff. I know that there are a number of books that are in the works coming to market. The only one that I know is actually published, I think, is actually in a different language. I think it's French, but I have to go and check that. I will try and go and look for or find the links for the relevant MSDN, so the developer APIs. Although the best starting point for all of that is definitely dev.windowsphone.com. Glenn, unfortunately, in terms of even if you registered for a business or a company account on the store, the corresponding live ID that you signed in with is still not transferable at the moment. Do we still have to go through IRS in the US for payments? Yes, my understanding is that process hasn't changed. They did streamline it a bit in terms of new developer accounts, so that the paperwork that you had to fill in is now much more streamlined. I think there's just a web form that you now have to fill in. Unfortunately, I'm again not in a position where I can give you tax advice on that. So if you've got any issues, then I'd ask you to follow that up with the support on the developer portal. So dev.windowsphone.com, and the help icon on the right hand side will actually give you the ability to raise a support ticket. They're really adamant, very keen to give you support for those type of issue. Yes, there is a lot more excitement coming around Windows Phone at the moment. We're doing a roadshow around Australia, both for developers and also talking to enterprises around Windows Phone 8, and everyone from the telcos through to individuals through to businesses are all excited about the opportunities that both Windows and Windows Phone 8 are presenting. Kim, the link for Moodle should have been sent out to your registered email address. If it's not, then feel free to email me, and I'll try and chase that to make sure that you've got access to the Moodle site. Yes, the Code Camp session in Sydney will be very similar to the content being presented here. It's a different style of event. It's a one-day series where we will take a condensed form of the Jumpstart series out of the US, and there won't be as much in future sessions for this event. We're actually going to try and do a lot more hands-on and actually show you more of the code samples going through. The Sydney developer event will be much more, will be a very high-level view of those on the first day, and then it'll actually have the opportunity on the second day to actually get hands-on in a workshop. So there'll be dedicated PCs with the SDK installed, so you can get started building your applications. We'll actually walk and do handhold through those labs. So if you do happen to be based in Australia and you feel like coming along to those, we've actually already run the Melbourne one, which we ran last weekend, so on the Friday and Saturday. We're running Brisbane this weekend. I think the lab day is actually booked out, but I'm sure that we can probably find some extra seats on Friday for those wanting to attend. The following week is Sydney, and then the week of I think it's the 7th of December. Yes, so the 7th and 8th of December, we'll be actually doing it across in Perth, doing the same event. So Tim, in terms of the support for maps, the arrangement that Microsoft and Nokia have come to is that the mapping platform for all Windows Phone devices or Windows Phone 8 devices will be based on the Nokia maps. And as such, we've got support within the development platform for the Nokia maps. So there's a separate control that you should be using in preference to the Bing Maps control, which is the new maps control. And there are a series of maps tasks, so the ability to download maps. And the maps are about just almost 300 megabytes worth of download. So, but once you download those, you get effectively the full mapping experience in an offline manner. So no more data charges for those, and it's very snappy and very fast as a control. So there's a number of tasks that are available to support that from within the development platform. There are some specific Nokia applications. So, for example, the specific Nokia Maps and Nokia Drive applications are specific to the Nokia phones. However, the built-in Maps application on every Windows Phone device is now powered by the Nokia Maps or the Navtec Maps that Nokia own. Vicky, at this point, we're not running the events in Canberra. Unfortunately, my guidance at this stage would be I'd suggest that you try and make it up to the Sydney ones if you can. Pim, presumably by the study center URL, I think you mean the Moodle site. My understanding is that that should be emailed out to you. If it's not, then I'll follow up with the organizers and make sure that it does get sent out to you. Mark, in terms of the database support, there's still support for Windows CE. That's the same as it was in Windows Phone 7. Windows 8 doesn't support SQL CE. In fact, both platforms now do support SQLite, so there is a build of the native SQLite runtime that you can use from within your application. Unfortunately, unlike Windows 8, where there's an additional project which provides a nice managed wrapper around SQLite, at this stage there is not a managed wrapper to go around the WinRT version of SQLite. However, there is a managed implementation of SQLite that actually works quite well. So my guidance is that if you're going to look at supporting both Windows Phone 8 and Windows 8, that you should look at this point, you should look at the managed implementation of SQLite with a view that once Microsoft does the additional legwork to provide a nice managed wrapper, that you can then move over to that for Windows Phone 8. And that will give you essentially code compatibility with Windows 8. If you're just looking at Windows Phone 7 or Windows Phone 8 compatibility, SQL CE is still probably one of the better options. It actually performs, my understanding, just as well as SQLite does because it's got a native implementation across both of them. Regan, unfortunately I don't have the links at hand for the Sydney event. If you go to, I think it's blogs.msdn.com/acote or dglover, both of them have the events listed on their blog, I think. So that's Dave Glover or Andrew Coates from Microsoft Australia. Both of them have the URLs for the up-and-coming events. Unable to get to labs, can assessment be emailed? The assessments will be, my understanding, the assessments will be virtual anyhow. I'm not sure if everyone can see this URL, but hang on, let me. That's the event for everyone who wants to access the registration for event for Australia-based events from the DPE team at Microsoft. So those events are going to be good because they'll actually be a hands-on event with instructors in the room or people in the room that know it. All right, well, we'll stay open for another 5 minutes if other people have got questions, and we'll look to wrap up about 8:45, so another 5 minutes. Williams asks, is there any tools to sync the database data in Windows Phone 8 with Windows 8 App Store? Currently, there's no tools available for that. The guidance would be to use something like, or to sync to some sort of cloud-based repository. You could make use of some of the new mobile, the Windows Azure mobile services, and use some of the APIs there, but you're really left writing a lot of that sync sort of infrastructure yourself, or sync, the synchronization mechanism. Again, yes, you can back up a Windows Phone 8 database to SkyDrive, but the process is literally copying the data file up to SkyDrive. I think, to be honest, that you'd almost be better off having some sort of synchronized mechanism into the cloud, so making use of SQL Azure or the mobile services to actually synchronize the actual data itself into the cloud. The danger of uploading the entire database into SkyDrive is that it works well as just a backup, but in terms of having multiple devices accessing the same data, it's not going to provide that conflict resolution that you're really going to be after there. So Williams asked, can you access the database via SkyDrive? You can. There's APIs available for reading and writing data or files from SkyDrive, you can't access the database in situ in SkyDrive. So it's not like you can do a remote database call to the database sitting in SkyDrive. It'd be literally a matter of copying the database file down from SkyDrive onto the local device and actually running the queries against it locally. So as we wrap up, I'd make a last couple of comments. Is that if you have questions, I really would encourage you to post them to the forum to start that level of discussion. Feel free to answer other people's questions if you happen to know the answer. That reduces the workload for everyone and facilitates that conversation. If you've got other things that you'd like us to cover specifically in the other sessions, feel free to suggest those. We will try and stick to the topics that have been outlined as part of the webinar series. But I'm always happy to take feedback as to the types of things that you guys are particularly interested in learning about. Can you store links to photos stored in SkyDrive in a local Windows Phone 8 database? I don't see any reason why you couldn't store links to those photos within the Windows Phone 8 database. Animation page transitions is a big part of Windows Phone. Are there any examples, guides for continue like a person's profile and native panorama effects? There's a sample that those native panorama and pivot effects are included as part of the SDK. So they're actually represented as part of the pivot and the panorama control that you can leverage. In terms of the default animations and page transitions, unlike Windows 8 where there are actually some default transitions as part of the SDK, the closest we have is actually the support within the toolkit. So if you actually use the Windows Phone toolkit, which is available by NuGet, that actually includes a number of the default page and page transitions that you can use. William, in terms of the download for the learning material, yes, you should be emailed out a link to Moodle, which is the site where we'll be posting all of the learning material, the labs, and it's got access to the general forums. So I anticipate that the content will go up there in the next 24 hours. So, all right, guys and girls, thank you very much for listening this evening. We'll actually draw the recording to a close. I'm actually going to probably drop off the call fairly shortly, but feel free to stay around and actually chat amongst yourselves if you'd like. Otherwise, I'll talk to most of you on the forums via Moodle.